My daughter tried to unravel our family by taking a DNA test behind my back. Guess what, Mom? Dad's not my real father, she said with a victorious smirk. I stayed calm, knowing she had no idea about the truth that would shatter everything she thought she knew. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when I stumbled upon the envelopian ordinary unmarked envelope, but inside it was something that would turn my world upside down. I, Sophia Lewis, had never been one to pry into things that didn't concern me, but that afternoon I felt an almost magnetic pull to open it. I had taken a DNA test a few months ago on a whim, just to learn more about my genetic heritage. What I didn't expect was the truth it would reveal. The results stared back at me from the page, bold and clear. David, the man I had called Dad for 25 years, wasn't my biological father. My heart slammed against my chest, and I couldn't breathe for a moment. I wasn't sure what hurt more, the shock of the truth or the wave of betrayal that crashed over me like an unforgiving tide. My hands trembled as I held the paper, trying to process the information. I thought I was imagining things, but I wasn't. The name on the document was unfamiliar to me. Mark Henson, a name I had never heard before. I could feel my pulse racing in my ears as I made my way to the living room, the paper still clutched tightly in my hand. My mother, Lisa, was sitting on the couch reading a book. She didn't notice me at first, but the moment she looked up, I knew something had changed in me. Something was different. I wasn't the same person I had been just minutes before. I marched over to her, my stomach tied in knots. My throat felt dry, as if words couldn't come out. When I finally spoke, it was as though I was speaking from someone else's body, someone I didn't recognize. "Mom," I said, my voice shaking. "What is this?" I threw the envelope onto the table between us, watching as she flinched. She didn't look surprised. Not at first. But there was something in her eyes, a flicker of fear, of regret that made my blood run cold. "Sophia, She began, but the words didn't come. She swallowed hard and took a deep breath, her hands trembling. I had never seen her look so small, so fragile. I hated that I could see the weight of the secret she had been keeping for so long. "Why didn't you tell me?" I demanded, my anger bubbling to the surface. "How long have you been lying to me? Does David know? Or have you been playing both of us for fools?" The words poured out of me like venom, sharp and unforgiving. But my mother remained silent for a moment, her eyes downcast, avoiding mine. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "Sophia, I never meant for this to happen. You need to understand." The room seemed to close in on me as she began to explain, her voice breaking as she told me everything. Mark, my biological father, had been a part of her life before she met David. She had fallen in love with him, but when she found out she was pregnant, he had left without a word. She had tried to reach out, but he vanished from her life. She never expected to raise a child on her own, but when she met David, he chose to love both her and me, never questioning whether or not I was his biologically. It didn't matter to him. He loved me like his own. "But why didn't you tell me sooner?" I asked, my voice raw with emotion, feeling the tears threaten to spill. "Why keep it from me all these years?" Her eyes filled with sorrow as she reached for my hand, squeezing it gently. "Because some truths are too heavy to bear all at once, Sophia. I wanted you to have a happy childhood, without the burden of a father who never wanted you. I didn't want you to grow up with the pain of that knowledge." I felt my heart shatter. Everything I had known about myself, about my family, was suddenly built on a lie. The man I had called Dad my entire life wasn't the man I thought he was. The question echoed in my mind, who am I really? The room grew silent, and I realized, with growing horror, that this was just the beginning. I had opened a door I wasn't ready to walk through, and now there was no turning back. I could feel the heat rising in my chest as I stormed into the kitchen, the envelope still clutched tightly in my hand. The thick paper felt heavier than it should have, as if it was a physical weight pulling me down into the depths of confusion and betrayal. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, but the sound of my mother's calm voice calling from the other room only seemed to make it louder. "Sophia?" she called, her voice light and unsuspecting. I felt a wave of anger rush over me, the last remnants of rationality slipping away. I had to know. I had to understand why my whole life had been built on a lie. "Mom," I called back, my voice tight with emotion. She came around the corner and froze when she saw the envelope in my hand. Her eyes darted to it, then quickly to me, and I could see the recognition in her face, the fear. "Sophia, what is it?" she asked softly, but I could tell from the way her voice trembled that she knew exactly what was coming. I slammed the envelope down onto the kitchen counter, watching her flinch. "Don't pretend you don't know," I snapped. "What's this? Why is David not my biological father?" The words felt foreign, even as I said them. They left my mouth before I could stop them, and the second they were out, I felt like the ground had just fallen away beneath me. I had always been sure of who I was. David was my father, the man who raised me, loved me, supported me. But this changed everything. My mother's face drained of color as she stepped back, her breath coming in short, quick gasps. Her hands trembled, and I saw the weight of the secret she'd kept for so long bear down on her. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out at first. The silence between us stretched, unbearable, as if the air itself was holding its breath. "Sophia, Her voice cracked, and she looked down, refusing to meet my eyes. The pain in her gaze was palpable, and I knew then that she had never meant for me to find out like this. I could see it, the guilt, the years of protecting me from a truth that was clearly too painful for her to share. I felt the anger bubble up inside me, threatening to overflow. "Why? Why didn't you tell me? How long have you been hiding this from me?" The words were harsh, and they tasted like bitterness on my tongue, but I couldn't stop them. I had to know. I had to hear her say it. Finally, she took a deep breath, steeling herself for the confession. "Mark," she whispered, her eyes still avoiding mine. "Mark Henson is your biological father." I couldn't breathe. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to run. Instead, I stood there, my legs trembling beneath me, as the weight of the revelation settled into my chest like a stone. Mark Henson, a name I didn't recognize, a man I had never heard of before. My mind spun with 1,000 questions, but one kept repeating itself over and over. Why had she kept this from me? "Sophia, it wasn't a secret I wanted to keep forever," she said softly, her voice breaking. "I never wanted to hurt you, but when I found out I was pregnant, Mark left. He walked away from us. I didn't want you to grow up with that pain, so I let David love you as his own." The pain in her voice cut through me, and for the first time, I saw the fear in her eyes, not for herself, but for me. She had tried to protect me, tried to shield me from the truth. But now, standing here with the DNA results in front of me, that protection felt like a lie. I couldn't look at her anymore. I turned away, the pieces of my life shattering around me. I needed space, time, anything to make sense of this. But in that moment, I realized there was no turning back. The truth was out, and I had no idea what to do with it. I couldn't stop shaking. The shock of the DNA results still hit me like a freight train, and everything I had known about my life, the man I had always called David, the man I'd spent every birthday with, the man who had raised me with love and patience was now in question. I couldn't stop thinking about the name that had appeared in the results. Mark Henson. Who was he? Why had my mother never mentioned him? Was he the person I should have been calling Dad? I couldn't stand it any longer. I had to talk to someone. I had to understand how everything I thought I knew about myself could suddenly feel so wrong. I thought about calling David, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. It didn't feel right, not yet. Instead, I walked back into the kitchen, my footsteps heavy against the wooden floor, the weight of the envelope still haunting me. When I saw Lisa sitting at the table, I froze. She was looking down at her hands, her expression tight, like she was bracing for something. I knew she was expecting me to ask more questions, and I could feel the knot in my stomach tighten. How could I possibly ask her to explain all of this when I barely understood it myself? Lisa, I whispered, the words barely escaping my lips. I stood at the threshold of the kitchen, feeling every inch of distance between us in that moment. The house felt too quiet, the walls closing in on me. I wanted to scream, but all I could do was stare at her. She looked up at me, and for the first time, I saw the years of worry in her eyes, the years of carrying a secret too heavy to share. Sophia, I know you must be angry, and I know this is hard for you, but I need you to listen to me, she said gently, her voice trembling. I nodded, though I wasn't sure I could listen to anything else. The truth felt too much, too overwhelming. I don't understand, I managed to say, the words scraping at my throat. Why didn't you tell me? Why did you keep this from me all these years? The silence between us stretched out, suffocating, as Lisa took a deep breath and finally began to speak. When I found out I was pregnant, I was scared. Marky wasn't ready to be a father. He told me he couldn't be the man I needed, and then he left. Just like that, he disappeared. I was left alone, with no one to help me. I couldn't understand. How could he leave? How could he just walk away? And yet, a part of me understood the decision. I knew life wasn't simple, that sometimes people made choices that seemed easier than facing the consequences. But why had Lisa made that decision for me? Why had she kept me from knowing? I met David not long after that, Lisa continued, her voice breaking. And he chose to love you as his own. He didn't have to, but he did. He made that choice, and he raised you, loved you, like you were his. I wanted you to have a life where you didn't have to know the pain of being abandoned. I thought if I kept the truth from you, it would protect you. I felt my chest tighten. A wave of anger, frustration, and confusion hit me all at once. Protect me? You thought lying to me would protect me? I felt my face burn with heat as my emotions bubbled over. I don't even know who I am anymore. How am I supposed to look at David the same way? How do I know what's real? David is real, Lisa said, her voice soft but firm. He has always been real. The love he gave you was real. I didn't want you to know the truth because I didn't want you to ever feel abandoned by him. He chose you, Sophia. He chose to be your father in every way that mattered, and nothing will ever change that. Her words struck me, but the storm inside me didn't settle. Instead, it churned. I could hear the sound of my own breath, shallow and unsteady. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that David loved me, that his choice had been real. But how could I when I had just learned that my life had been a lie? How could I move forward with this truth hanging over me? The room felt too small, the air thick with the weight of the conversation. And yet, even as my world seemed to fall apart, I couldn't ignore the one thing that kept ringing in my mind. David had chosen me. He didn't have to, but he had. I stood there, staring at Lisa, trying to reconcile the emotions battling inside me. I didn't know how to make sense of it all yet, but I knew one thing. The love I had with David was real. And somehow, no matter what, that had to be enough. I stood in the doorway, the weight of the DNA results still heavy in my hands, unsure of what to do next. The rage, confusion, and pain were swirling inside me, but what I needed most right now was to speak with David. I knew I couldn't keep running away from this truth that had completely shattered everything I thought I knew about myself. But could I handle the conversation? Could I face the man I had always called my father, knowing that the bond between us was built on a lie? I hadn't talked to him yet. David was still at work, and I hadn't told him what I had discovered. Part of me felt like I needed to tell him right away, but another part of me was terrified of how the truth would affect him. How could I look him in the eye after everything I had learned? How could I make him understand the storm that was raging inside me? I found myself pacing the living room, unable to sit still. Every step felt like it echoed, the silence around me suffocating. I could almost hear the distant sound of David's footsteps as he walked through the door, and that thought made my stomach drop. The door opened, and I didn't even have to look up to know it was him. David stepped inside, his coat hanging loosely on his shoulders, a briefcase in one hand. He smiled when he saw me, but it faltered when he noticed the expression on my face. There was something in my eyes, something that made him stop in his tracks. "Sophia?" he asked softly, his voice always calm, steady, like it had been for the past 25 years. "What's wrong?" I didn't answer right away. My heart was racing. The words felt too big, too heavy. I wanted to tell him everything, to scream out my confusion and hurt, but I couldn't find the strength to say it all aloud. "David," I said, my voice coming out hoarse. I found something today." I could feel his gaze on me, but I couldn't bring myself to meet it. I was too afraid of seeing the disappointment in his eyes, too afraid that everything we had would crumble under the weight of the truth. "What did you find, Sophia?" he asked, his voice gentle now, as though he already sensed that something was terribly wrong. I took a deep breath, still clutching the envelope in my hand. "I took a DNA test and the results came back. You're not my biological father, David." The words hung in the air between us, and I saw his expression change. His face remained neutral, but his eyes were searching, as if trying to gauge my seriousness. I wanted to explain, to tell him that I didn't want it to be true, but the truth was staring us both in the face. He didn't speak at first, just stood there in stunned silence. It was the longest moment of my life. My pulse thundered in my ears, drowning out everything else. David took a step forward, his face unreadable, but I saw a flash of something behind his eyes, a flicker of hurt, confusion, maybe even fear. "Sophia," he finally said, his voice low and steady, "I've known you weren't biologically mine for a long time." My chest tightened, and I felt the world shift beneath me. He had known? He had known all along? The question burned in my throat, but before I could ask it, he spoke again. "It doesn't matter," he said softly, taking a step closer to me. "You're my daughter, Sophia. Always have been, always will be. A piece of paper doesn't change that." I looked up at him then, the words he spoke landing like a soft but steady anchor in the storm of my emotions. How could he say that so easily? How could he accept this so calmly? Was he really okay with it? The man who had raised me, who had given me everything, was that love still real, even if I wasn't his? "David," I began, but the words caught in my throat. "I don't know what to believe anymore." He reached out, gently taking my hand in his grip warm and reassuring. "You believe in us," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You believe in the love we've always shared, and that's all that matters. Biology isn't what makes a family, Sophia. I'm your father in every way that matters. I always have been." The tears I had been holding back finally broke free, spilling down my face. I let out a breath I didn't even know I was holding. The storm inside me hadn't calmed completely, but hearing David's words felt like a lifeline I hadn't expected to find. He pulled me into an embrace, and for the first time since I found out the truth, I felt something resembling peace. "I'm here," he whispered into my ear. "Always will be. Nothing changes that." And as I stood there, wrapped in the arms of the man who had always chosen me, I realized that maybe, just maybe, this truth, this revelation, wasn't as much of a loss as I'd thought. The love we had built wasn't defined by DNA. It was defined by the choice we made to be family, every single day. The silence between us stretched on, thick and suffocating. I couldn't tear my eyes away from David, still holding me, still murmuring that everything would be okay. But a part of me, a part that I couldn't seem to quiet, was screaming that nothing would ever be okay again. The truth had shattered something inside me, and even though David's words comforted me, I still felt lost in this sea of uncertainty. "I don't know if I can move on from this," I whispered, my voice barely audible, but the words were heavy, like a confession I hadn't meant to make. Everything I thought I knew, everything I thought was real, it's all been changed. David pulled back just enough to look me in the eye, His face was serious now, but still filled with that warmth I had always relied on. I know this is hard, Sophia, he said softly. But you don't have to go through it alone. We'll figure this out together. I shook my head, feeling the tears press against my eyelids. But how? I asked, my voice breaking. How can we just keep going? How can I look at you the same way when everything's been built on a lie? The fear in my chest was suffocating, but David didn't look away. His gaze never wavered. Because the love we've shared, Sophia, that's real. That's what matters. Blood doesn't define us. What we've built, what you and I have, is stronger than any of this. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that the years of love, the countless moments that had made David my father, could still hold up against the weight of this truth. But doubt gnawed at me, threatening to tear apart the foundation we'd built. David, I whispered again, the words coming easier now. I'm sorry for doubting you. I need time. He nodded, his grip on my hand tightening ever so slightly. Take all the time you need. I'm here. I always will be. For the first time since I'd learned the truth, I felt a glimmer of hope. The truth might have turned my world upside down, but the one thing that remained unchanged was the man in front of me. The man who chose me, who loved me, and who had always been there no matter what. That was something I could hold on to. And for the first time, I believed that maybe we could find our way through this together. The story of Sophia and David highlights the profound importance of love, trust, and the choices we make in relationships, rather than just relying on biological ties. In our modern lives, we often face challenges and moments of uncertainty, especially when confronted with unexpected truths. This story teaches us the value of open communication, forgiveness, and understanding that family is built on love and commitment, not just blood. In our current world, it's essential to remember that true connection and family are defined by the effort and care we invest in each other. When faced with difficult revelations or misunderstandings, it's important to approach them with patience and empathy, just like David did with Sophia. Don't let doubts or past mistakes define your future relationships. Use honesty and love as the foundation to overcome challenges and grow stronger together.